This channel right fucking here, this is my side of the story. This is my testimony to the universe. No matter what happens or where I go or what happens to me, this is always going to be here as my solidified testimony, as my little blip in the history of the world that tells my story, and for those who may relate to it or find it helpful because they find some of themselves in it or someone they know in it, this is what it's for, to create a bunch of understanding. Because I'm a weirdo, but weirdos are your neighbors. And so maybe you might come to understand your neighbors who are a little bit like me. Or maybe you're that neighbor who's not being understood, and you can show them these videos. But I was caught up in a web of lies for the longest time. For as much as I pride myself on authenticity and genuinity, and throughout my channel's history, I've put a lot of effort in maintaining those principles, in aspiring to those ideals. I've slipped as far as my personal life is concerned. In particular, I slipped in the realm of my gender identity. And in that video that I made declaring that I am not transgender, that I am in fact non-binary and use any all pronouns, I also stated that I could not fight a lie with more lies, that rather I had to come to the truth and lay the truth bare to all who may hear it, and they can take or leave whatever they'd like from it. And there was a lot of emotion and power behind that sentiment simply because of how dishonest living as a transgender woman was for me to experience. Like, I struggled to leave my house or to talk to anyone, even friends that I had online, the moment that I started identifying as a trans woman, let alone taking hormones. I could be speaking with this exact same intonation, not having done voice training and so on, but because I had changed my identity, I knew that on the other end, people were expecting something of me. And because people were expecting something of me, I had to adhere to those expectations. I had to present myself like the person they thought I was. And that put an immense amount of pressure onto me because I was not being expected to be who I am. I was being expected to be the person I said I was. And so I didn't just feel uncomfortable or, dare I say, dysphoric in my physical interactions with people who were now deeming me to be female and treating me as such, or at least making overtures in that direction. This was also the case in my internet friendships, and whenever the subject would come up or something pertaining to the subject, I had to respond with grand and fanciful narratives that supported the idea that I was this thing that I claimed that I was, regardless of how true any of those things actually were. More often than not, they were just convoluted narratives that took things that were true, kind of screwed around with them, looked at them from the right angle, and omitted everything else that did not directly contribute to the narrative that I was attempting to weave. And in so doing, I created a person, but that person was not me. And of course, this is going to be a viscerally alienating experience to undertake because you are not acting out yourself, you are method acting the character that you've designed. I don't have to act when I'm speaking to my best friend, No Thank You, or my significant other and soon to be wife, Sophia. I simply say what comes to my mind because there's no need for me to follow up on a web of lies that I've carefully constructed or not so carefully constructed. I don't need to worry about contradicting something I've said prior and then lying and lying and lying and lying in order to keep the lie consistent. There isn't a whole person that I've structured. It's just me. And so I can respond with exactly what's on my mind or exactly what's always been on my mind. And that's such a thoroughly liberating experience for me because my whole life I felt like I could not do that. When I was growing up, I often got in trouble for things that I did not do. But if I told the truth, rarely was it enough for my parents or the authority figures around me. So I had to create some lies in order to cover that up. But I also got in trouble for things I did do, and the punishments that I feared, in retrospect now, are not punishments that I deserved. Like, of course, there should have been some kind of retribution or reprimanding for the bad behavior that I was engaging in. It should have been discouraged, but the response was disproportionate. And so, because I feared that disproportionate response, I learned how to lie really quickly. And I mean fast. I learned how to respond as a person I wasn't and to be consistent with the narrative of that person that I wasn't, like in the blink of an eye, to where it just sounded like I was that person. And then if you look at the very collectivistic, tightly knit, southern rural community that I lived in, evangelical community that I lived in, there was an even bigger um, precedent for conforming. You know, like there was a lot of pressure put on you to do that. Is there a mouse there? Yeah, there might be. I don't know where the mice are in here. Sometimes they're all around, to be quite honest with you. I've seen like multiple just in the past week. But in that community, I was forced to, just for the sake of safety, portray myself a certain way. Now, I've always had firmly anti authoritarian intuitions and instincts, so a lot of the time I bucked that trend, and it felt really good every time that I did. But for the sake of practicality, much of the time I did not. And that only further instilled this pattern of behavior in me, um, to the point where like I became like the George Santos of life. Like I would just lie about stuff that I did not have to lie about that was totally irrelevant. You know how that New York congressman, when they found out that he had lied about his entire life story, there were a bunch of interviews he did where he lied about like working with kids or being a volleyball star, like totally inconsequential information on his resume that you would think did absolutely nothing to affect his standing in the election. He lied about those things anyway, really minute details. I did that. I did that kind of thing growing up, and unfortunately, that behavior continued on into my adulthood, even my not so distant past. And so, I was identifying as this transgender person, after being pressured and pressured and pressured by these trans girls that I was friends with, that I was attracted to, um, and this general confusion about my identity due to the place where I grew up, which had heavily conformist, essentialistic conceptions of gender imposed on you, which led me to think that I couldn't just be a multifaceted male, that if I wanted to have that range of emotions, I had to be female. It was the perfect storm for me to have some confusion about myself, and then when I actually tried to live out that identity and realized just how viscerally I disliked living as that, um, I kept lying and saying that I was that, because I knew there were a number of benefits I could have, that I could convince some lonely incel to date me and basically take care of me so I could be a NEET forever. And um, I knew that there were certain economic and social benefits that came from being that kind of person on the internet. And I also was frankly too ashamed to basically come out and say, hey guys, I'm not actually this thing, I was wrong, because of how intense the pressure was from those trans friends that I had, and just about everybody else that I knew who wasn't even trans. So, needless to say, I was very ashamed. So, I continue lying about my identity and living out this person that by that point I already knew I didn't want to be, because even just being called that feminine name that I had, Lily, and having people treat me as though I was a woman caused so much discomfort in me. It caused me to be silent, it caused me to be anxious, it caused me to just feel like disgusted. Like, I feel like this is the way that actual transgender people feel all the time when they're misgendered. You take a trans woman, for example, when they get dead named or treated like a guy, I feel like they must feel exactly how I felt when people were treating me like I was a woman. And so that's what gender dysphoria is. And people who are cis or people who are, gender nonconforming in other ways, they can have it too. It's just this disconnect with how one is perceived and treated based on the affectations that they present, that inside they feel as though different affectations should be ascribed to them. And so, um, that was a negative experience. Really, really negative. And it made me feel like I wasn't even like a person to the people around me. Like, none of my friendships were even real because none of them knew who I was. And it led me to feel so isolated from everyone, like I was completely, completely alone. In my last video, called Not a Creator But a Person, I ended it by saying that, I've always felt kind of like an island, kind of on my own, but I meant that in a positive, like, individualistic way in that video. Um, Obviously, you're gonna want some people in your orbit that you can rely on and that, you know, they can rely on you. At this time, I felt like I was just totally in the dark. Like, no one was in my corner because nobody even knew, like, they didn't even have a semblance of who I was. That, like, not even the faintest idea. But I was every day getting up and performing this person. And it was painful. It was really, really, really painful. Um, and I ended up drinking every single day to deal with the pain of performing this person without even being on hormones, by the way. So this was before HRT. HRT just confirmed my opinion that I didn't want to be that person. I started drinking all the time and I started, doing the drugs more because, like, I would jump into calls with my then boyfriend and he would treat me feminine and all this stuff. And I'd have to do this whole song and dance acting like the person that he thought I was because I thought, well, I guess this is who I'm stuck being. And at least if I do this whole song and dance with this guy, then maybe I can get a visa and live in Germany. And also, part of me did genuinely love him. Part of me, like, really liked what he had going on as a person. And I was no doubt attracted to him because I'm bisexual. But I had so many times when I just desperately wished this person could love me for being a male. That I could have just been in a healthy gay relationship with that guy. I think if I hadn't lied so much all the time, maybe that relationship could have actually been happy or normal. But instead, because I was lying so much and portraying myself like someone I wasn't, I I ended up just treating him in the most despicable way possible. And I say I've forgiven myself for that, but to be honest, like, I still feel really bad for being so deceptive because that guy wasn't a bad guy. I mean, he did some pretty bad things to me, but you can almost understand it given the bad things that I was doing. Not to say two wrongs makes a right, but it's understandable. Um, and so I feel a lot of pain when I recall that whole arc and time in my life. The just the sheer amount of deception that existed in that time. Because I truly felt like I was alone. I was so uncomfortable with everything about who I was and how I was perceived that it led me to, like, having these emotional outbursts constantly. Like, my emotions were like a constant roller coaster. I was basically like a BPD person with the way that I was behaving and feeling, um, because I was so isolated and confused, that I was basically lashing out 24/7, violently uncomfortable with this person that I was being seen as, and this reality, this prison that I created for myself. Um, and I get on HRT and it only exacerbates all that because I got totally sober then. And before, I was drinking and using the drugs to kind of isolate myself, to make it to where all those moments when I was angry at my ex or at my friends, or when I felt sad and isolated and wanted to have an outburst, I could just suppress it by using those drugs or drinking. Um, and I also had more emotional control because I wasn't going through a second puberty. I didn't have these second sex hormones that make you specifically really emotionally volatile, prone to impulse, and irrational during that puberty. And so, I take away these tools that I was using for emotional regulation, when I was spending most of my time by myself. And then I replaced that with a factor that was very destabilizing, which was hormones. And those hormones made me so emotional, like it was like 100 emotions a minute. And whereas before, I had trouble controlling my impulses because I was so uncomfortable with how I was being perceived and how I was presenting and who I was being seen as, and having to do all the lies all the time, it was exhausting. I always had that ability to kind of take my free prefrontal cortex and rein myself in. Like that willpower part of us that is definitely not the main driver of our behavior. The main driver of our behavior is mostly like in the back of the brain, not the front. Um, I was able to reel myself in most of the time to prevent myself from doing anything too egregious. But without, you know, those tools that I was using to isolate myself and to decompress, and with all of these new volatile emotions added to what was already a deeply volatile and uncomfortable and bad situation, it was basically just putting oil on a fire. And that fire burned and it spread all over. And so, what I ended up doing was alienating most of my friends, um, cheating on the partner that I had, destroying those relationships in the process, just blowing them up, um, and becoming an all around ghoulish and impulsive person. Like, I was blowing money nonstop, which is something I never did before. I never did that in my life. I was always pretty good with the money that I had. I was just running around all over the place, like self harming and engaging in risky behaviors, lashing out at everyone. I went nuts. And by the end of it, I wanted to kill myself. My relationships were over. I lost a bunch of my friends. I felt like, it's over for me. It's done. But instead of killing myself, I chose a social suicide. I said, all right then, I'm going to detransition. There are clearly no benefits to me living this lie anymore, and it's already caused so much destruction that I wish I did this earlier. But if I'm going to kill myself over this, then I might as well commit a different kind of a suicide, which is a social suicide. And so that's what I did. I came out and I said I wasn't transgender, and there was backlash. There were people who tried to manipulate me back into it time and time again. I was pressured from all kinds of different sides, and I gave into it for a little bit, but ultimately I've held strong, and I've came out and I've said this is how it is and this is who I am. You don't know me better than I know myself. And people can take that or leave it. But I know that I'm happier living like this than I ever was living like that. And I deeply regret putting everyone that I knew through that whole train wreck. and putting myself through that train wreck too, because it was completely unnecessary. The good thing is, though, I got some decent videos and some decent art out of it, so I can't really complain. I guess everything happens for a reason. Um, but wow, that was by far the worst period of my life ever. That whole transgender thing. Um, I just, I can't even. I mean, I've been trying to describe how bad it was throughout this whole video and throughout multiple videos now. It feels like I can't even scratch the surface of how unstable I became. I went from being like calm and comfy and a rational entity that was just hanging out. I didn't understand a lot of things. I had some instability, some problems, but I went into that transgender thing and it's like I just went nuts. And and that's what's going to happen to people who are trenders, or maybe they're pressured into it, or maybe they're like lying to themselves to try to get some kind of social gain. People who aren't really trans, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. You're playing with fire, and no, it's no wonder because you're fundamentally restructuring yourself to be someone that you're not. So just embrace who you are. And the people who are actually transgender, they can actualize themselves by taking the hormones and presenting themselves as who they are. But because that's not who I am, it was never going to work like that. Um, wow. I guess that was my attempt at dissecting this massive and cryptic web of lies. Um, I again feel like I have barely scratched the surface of that hormone induced mania and obtuse obfuscation of all that I am. So, if you were to glean anything from this, like literally anything, I think it would be to be honest with yourself and those around you, because being dishonest is bad as a behavior in and of itself, but I feel like people don't realize that being dishonest, it isn't just one action. Like, it leads to a bunch of auxiliary actions that are also bad. Like, one lie leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to another. And this will degrade you overall as a person. Like it will make you hate yourself more, which will in turn make you behave worse because you're behaving like the person you see yourself as, which is bad. Um, and the more you do that, the more it's like a big cycle because like it generally bad behavior begets bad behavior. Like you do it a little bit and it hurts and you're not discouraged from it. You're not really given any real incentives to get out. So you just keep reoffending and doing bad stuff and feeling worse about yourself and the world, and it's all just a big loop of badness. That's where lying gets you. If it weren't for my friends, no thank you, Dosmite, and a couple others, the real ones who stuck with me and understood after I did the whole detransition thing, I'd be completely fucked right now. Like, I don't know what I'd be doing, but it would probably be really bad and very different from what I'm doing now. So if I didn't have those real ones, the homies, the people who I found out were really with me the whole time, to encourage me to be a good person and actively told me that they saw a good person in me, yeah, I'd be totally fucked right now. So, your self perception is going to be everything here. It's crucial, and you're only degrading your self perception and your overall experience with the world the bigger your web of lies becomes. So, the best thing you can do is to not have one in the first place. Just tell the truth.